Everyone, hello. It's so wonderful to see so many members of the TC community here today for our event. My name is Elisa Ewan, and I am the Assistant Director of Alumni Relations at Teachers College. Thank you for joining us today for our Alumni Career Development webinar, which is co-sponsored by TC Next and Alumni Relations. This monthly series covers a wide range of professional development topics and features alumni speakers from a variety of industries. This is one of the many ways you can stay engaged to your TC family. I'd like to quickly remind you of a few more ways you can maintain a meaningful connection to TC. 1. Hire TC students and alumni. 2. Refer prospective students back to the college. 3. Show your pride by including Teachers College in all of your professional credentials. 4. Share your talents and expertise by volunteering to speak at TC events or by joining one of our Alumni Association committees. And 5. When the time is right for you, show your philanthropic support for TC by donating to the TC Fund. Today, for this informative Meet the Funders event, we are joined by a fantastic panel who will help you in demystifying the grant process. Our panelists include Leigh Ross from the New York Community Trust, Brooke Stafford-Brizard from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, Gisele Shorter from the Raikes Foundation, and Carolyn O'Brien from the JP Morgan Private Foundation Services. It's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Priya Sircar from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. Priya Sircar is a nonprofit administrator and practicing artist with experience in both fundraising and grant making. As the director of the arts program at the Knight Foundation, she develops strategies for arts investments in cities across the United States where Knight has offices. She joined Knight from Lord Cultural Resources, where she specialized in strategic and cultural planning for the arts, cultural, and heritage organizations and communities in the United States and abroad. Priya began her career at the Lance Armstrong Foundation, now Livestrong, helping build a global cancer survivorship movement. Starting in development there, she later established the foundation's National Community Grant Program and founded its annual Community and Capacity Building Conference of Grantees. Our knowledgeable panel will be taking questions from the audience during the latter part of our event, so feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A pane below. For the sake of your fellow audience members, we ask that you keep your questions broadly focused. Please avoid asking specific questions about funding your organization or personal interests. And also, don't forget to introduce yourself, let us know where you're joining from, and what organization you're with in the chat. If you have any technical or audio issues, do not hesitate to reach out to us in the chat and let us know how we can help. Without further ado, please help me welcome our moderator today, Priya Sircar.
Hi, Elisa, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are calling from. I'm Priya Sircar, a proud TC alum, and so just honored that TC invited me to be part of today's discussion. Really excited to be here with you today and looking forward to today's conversation with the panelists and to the questions that you all share. So I definitely want to just echo Elisa's invitation to, please share your questions in the chat and we'll get to as many as we can. And we know that we have some great opening kind of remarks and presentations from the panelists where they'll be letting us know more about each of their organizations and the work that each of them do. And so some questions that you might have, burning questions at this moment, may get answered, but we look forward to what other questions today's conversation might spark. We are going to be starting out by each sharing a bit about our organizations. I'll give a very quick overview of the Jonas and James L. Knight Foundation, or the Knight Foundation for short, and then we'll get to hearing from the panelists. And what we are looking forward to in today's conversation is you're talking about a range of topics. We'll talk about some big picture things like what our organizations look for, what type of work we're doing, what we've observed over the past year, which has been, of course, a really challenging year for so many and for so many folks that our organizations serve. And we'll also talk about more detailed things like, how to build strong grantee, grantor, or applicant and funder relationships, and kind of some more nitty-gritty detailed topics as well. So we hope that you'll find something useful in today's conversation. So just a little bit about the Jonas and James L. Knight Foundation. We're a national foundation that has local roots. So we're based in Miami, Florida. I'm coming at you now from sunny Miami. And we also have offices in 7 other cities in the US where we fund. And we actually fund in 26 communities around the US total, including those 8 core cities. The other 18 cities, we work through community foundations to do that grant making. And we fund in primarily 3 areas. We have our journalism program, and that's really where our foundation got its roots. We were founded with an endowment formed by the Knight brothers, who at one time owned the largest newspaper chain in the country. And our mission is to give back in those communities where they owned papers. And really our mission is to cultivate informed and engaged communities, because we believe those form the basis of a strong democracy. We do those through funding in journalism, funding in the arts, which is the area in which I work, and also funding in kind of a broader category called community and national initiatives, which kind of vary from city to city, depending on the focus of that particular program and director. And so that's just a bit about the Knight Foundation. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that may come up later in the Q&A portion if folks have questions and would like to know more. So with that, I would love to turn it over to begin the panelist introductions. And today we'll start with Leigh Ross with the New York Community Trust. Leigh?
Thank you, Priya, and it's really wonderful to be here with you all today. As Priya said, I'm Leigh Ross. I work at the New York Community Trust. For those of you who are not familiar with the Trust, we are New York City's community foundation. And we have 2 mechanisms for grant making. We have competitive grants and donor advised funds. Our competitive grants are made possible primarily by funds set up by donor bequests and wills. I work in the competitive grants program, which accounts for about $40 million in grants annually out of about $200 million in grants total, give or take, year to year. We also have a great number of living donors who suggest grants from donor advised funds, and those funds don't accept proposals. Those of us who administer competitive grants are available for the Trust donor advisors to consult if they wish to, and some do. But for the most part, those 2 types of grant making happen fairly independently. So today, my comments will focus almost exclusively on our competitive grants program. The competitive grants themselves are supported by hundreds of different funds. Some are very flexible and can be essentially used at our discretion. And others were created for more particular purposes that range from specific to broad. So for example, I have a narrow purpose fund that I administer that is focused on the study and improvement of international communication. So that would be an example of like a very specific fund. But for the most part, it's very broad. Like, you know, I have funds that are for the health and the well-being and benefit of children in New York City, or sometimes it's, you know, children in the public schools. Our competitive grant making across those funds is sort of divvied up into three buckets: healthy lives, thriving communities, and promising futures. And then those three broad areas encompass a variety of different portfolios that are focused on everything from health and behavioral health to community development to the arts and culture, to making the civil and criminal justice systems more effective, to the environment. And then I myself oversee three portfolios: girls and women, early childhood, and arts education. And across those different portfolios, we focus almost exclusively on projects and programs that are happening within New York City's 5 boroughs. There are some limited exceptions. Our environmental grants program, for example, makes grants to some international programs. But for the most part, we're all about New York City. And in general, we fund programs that improve or expand direct services, that build the capacity of organizations, or that in some way support efforts to promote change in systems or policy. So that tends to involve a lot of support for organizing and advocacy. What we don't support are grants to individuals or for general operating support. So that's all I'll say for now, but I look forward to answering questions folks may have or delving in deeper as we go forward.
Thanks, Leigh. So next we'll go to Gisele Shorter with the Raikes Foundation. Gisele.
Greetings. My name is Gisele C Shorter, and I lead the National K-12 Portfolio of Giving at the Raikes Foundation and support our policy efforts. The Raikes Foundation is committed to supporting youth-serving systems to become just and equitable. So collectively, our team is working toward a just and inclusive society where all young people have the support they need to reach their full potential. Our historic out-of-school time portfolio sunset last year. Today, our anchor investments are organized into 1, the National Education Strategy, 2, the Youth and Young Adult Homelessness and an extended regional homelessness strategy, and then 3, the Impact-Driven Philanthropy, which launched organizations like Giving Tech Labs and Giving Compass. As catalytic system funders, we prioritize really anchoring on integrated solutions and supporting field level efforts. So my portfolio of giving is anchored on school and system redesign, the heartbeat of which is the Building Equitable Learning Environments Network. I'll do a little bit of a deeper dive on what makes us unique. So one of the distinct aspects of the Raikes Way that distinguishes our version of philanthropic strategy from others is how we define the problem and where we center the imperative of educational equity. Seeing the problem as one of system design has led us to focus on structural issues, how to redesign schools and higher ed institutions to be equitable learning environments that meet the needs of each and every student. We strive for, unapologetically so, an educational system that reliably creates learning environments where whole, healthy, empowered educators and students thrive, and where race, class, gender, language, or any other social or cultural factor hold zero negative predictive power over students' experience and their outcomes. So generally speaking, our national education strategy is organized into 3 buckets. So SOLD, or the Science of Learning and Development investments that synthesize the science and build the warrant for addressing critical aspects of development and equity-centered system change to inform both policy and practice. Two, BELL, again, Building Equitable Learning Environments, and SEP are learning hubs investing in districts, higher ed institutions, and their partners to develop evidence-based methods, resources, and capacities for leading school and system redesign for equity. And the third is policy investments to build the capacity amongst policymakers, system leaders, and advocates to make locally defined progress on advancing an equity-centered science of learning and development informed agenda. We partner with grassroots and grasstops coalitions, researchers, community organizers, inclusive of students, families, educators, and leading intermediaries to more deeply understand who is least well served by our current system and elevate learnings about the paths and resources required for districts, in my case, to transform the experience of school and reliably create equitable outcomes. You know, prior to 2020, a central goal of our strategy, or our national ed strategy, was to support exponentially more education field actors to better understand, this definition of the problem, or see the system from the lens or experience of those that have been least well served by the current system. In doing so, we saw partners move from insufficient technical solutions toward more effective work on structural changes. Shifts from intervention or interventional approaches aimed at what students and educators must be able to do, show, or manifest, to really integrated solutions that attune to the policies, the procedures, the mechanisms for creating equitable learning environments that set the conditions for students and adults to thrive. And then 2020 happened, right? So through 2020, we saw the impact of inequitable structures playing out even more starkly across the country as we grapple with the compounded impact of a health crisis, a financial crisis, the crisis of police violence that triggered social and racial reckoning, and then an education crisis that upended most, if not all, of the conventions of how schooling has been enacted and done in this country. So the intersecting crises have supported more folks to see inequitable structures in the system in new ways, find greater value in our analysis and those of our aligned partners, and expanded vision for the goals of the education system. Raikes infrastructure and catalytic investments continue to offer a pathway forward that is increasingly a base map, right? Transformation at the intersection of the science of learning and human development, equity, and community leadership. As a network of inspired educators, researchers, nonprofit organizations, and aligned funders, the Building Equitable Learning Environments, BELL network, is collectively creating the resources and tools to build a better, equitable version of public education in America so that every student can unlock their full potential. Finally, our K-12 grant making is aligned to our BELL theory of action. So we partner to curate, share, develop communications and policies designed to motivate and support adults to act in and across systems so that all students experience the types of relationship-rich environments that nurtures their academic, social, and emotional development. I guess in closing, I would lift up that we're really in service of and prioritize funding across 3 different lanes in the K-12 portfolio. So it's the applied practice, support, and learning hubs, right? The extent to which folks, organizations have not only existing footprint, but are in service of shifting the experience of school and supporting those systems to reliably produce equitable outcomes. The knowledge base, so the research and practice continuum that includes a set of high yield tools, resources, and policies that have worked somewhere in the country and that can act as a set of resources so that districts and schools that are in service of educational justice and wanting to be transformed or initiate transformation can lean in and have a starter dough, if you will. And then our ecosystem and field development. So supporting, Bell aligned, right? And when I say Bell, equity aligned champions across the ed ecosystem that are not only aware, but internalizing, metabolizing the science, and also aspiring to transform in their own context and expand the work. So excited to be in this conversation with you.
Thank you, Gisele. So next we'll go to Brooke Stafford-Brizard with Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. Brooke.
Thanks, Priya. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're calling from. I'm joining you from Northern California, and really happy to be here today. I work at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and I lead our research to practice work, which I'll share a little bit more about. But I also say I'm a proud graduate of the Cognitive Sciences and Education program at Teachers College. And I hope you will see how that has deeply informed my work and the work that we're doing at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. Because I was a teacher before I did my graduate work at TC. And when I did that deep work in human development, I learned a lot of what I wished I had known as a teacher. Yet 20 plus years later, we're still not preparing teachers through that, the lens of human development, the way that we believe we can. So our work at the initiative is focused on a North Star that we anticipate will take multiple generations to achieve, but it's really grounded in a broader definition of success, and kind of redefining what we mean by education in America. And so that incorporates the knowledge, skills, habits, and agency that individuals need to thrive, and inclusive of what we currently kind of define as the high school diploma, but beyond that. And so our work is really about broadening that and ensuring that race or income are not predictive of any component of that definition of success. I want to spend a little bit of time kind of defining what we mean by that, because it informs our investments and kind of how we think about it. Because we take a whole child approach to education. And that means a lot of different things in different spaces. So it could mean kind of just a limited definition of social emotional learning, or what we do is, and you'll hear a lot of similarities between the way that we frame our work and what Gisele shared at Raikes, because we're close partners and proud to be close partners. But we name that definition of whole child, grounded in the sciences of human learning and development. And so that's inclusive of academic development. So the first thing we reinforce with our grant making and our partnership is that academics and whole child are not a dichotomy. You don't do either or. We think about how it all integrates together in a learning environment, because you can't tease these apart in the human being. So we name 6 domains of development when we define whole child. Academic is one of them. We also name social emotional development. We named cognitive development, so skills like executive function that have not been, until recent years, kind of named as something that are really critical for all individuals. And that includes things like cognitive flexibility, shifting attention at the right time. The fourth area we define is identity development. And I think in philanthropy in particular, even up to a few years ago, when we talked about identity in education, we focused on academic identity alone. And our work in identity development pulls from research in gender identity, racial ethnic identity, and academic identity, and kind of thinks about how individuals show up as multifaceted human beings in classrooms and learning environments. The last 2 areas that we name are physical and mental health. Not that we fund or anticipate that every school is going to have a functioning health clinic, but we recognize that, again, you can't tease these apart for the human child or the human being. And so we name them as really critical in areas that we think about supporting integration of and learning environments. A couple things about how we approach that definition of whole child that, again, inform our grant making. One, it's asset-based. And so when I say things like mental health, we ground in definitions and frameworks that are asset-based. So we don't define mental health by depression, anxiety, We define it by well-being, holistic well-being that every human being needs. And we partner with organizations like the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin to understand that it's human connection, sense of purpose, understanding of ourselves that drive well-being. And the second is we draw from multiple sciences to inform this framework. So it's not just individual skills. We don't think about whole child as just like what skills does the child need. We draw from the sciences of context as well. So public health, and so we think about sociology as how it informs our work. All of those help us prioritize not just the development of individual skills, but recognition of our focus on the context around the child. So we focus a lot on adult capacity and learning environments around students. Our diagnosis of the challenge in our system that is what we're addressing to reach that broader definition of success is one of systemic racism. And so we focus on how we're thinking about, very similar to Raikes and what Gisele shared, how are we addressing the context of systemic racism that is impacting our students and our adults in the system, and has created an environment of kind of dehumanization. So our focus is really on how do we support humanizing educational environments, and that brings us to a very tight focus right now on relationships, and ensuring that students experience identity affirming relationships, racially affirming relationships in their learning environments, and ensuring that they don't have to leave any part of themselves behind when they're engaging in learning. The toolkit that we use at CZI, or the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, is broad. We not only have grant making as a toolkit, we have a ventures portfolio, so we do have a team that's focused on impact investing that we connect with, but is central to the organization and not necessarily just on education. We also have technology teams who are building products in partnership with some of our the organizations that we engage with and fund. And we also place a large focus on convening, because our research to practice work is about connecting innovative partnerships through research to practice funding. So we want to support the connection of educational researchers, but also, like I said, sociologists, public health researchers, neuroscientists with practitioners, so educators, system leaders, but also social workers and doctors. And we want to fund these innovative partnerships to bring that whole child practice to learning environments. To Gisele's point as well, 2020 happened. And I will say that our focus on the whole child, our focus on relationships and well-being stayed very central to how we focused on supporting schools and our partners and systems last year. And we will continue to build on that work to support the science of relationships in classrooms. And just some of the nuts and bolts, we do direct grant making, but we also have run competitive grants, both open and closed requests for applications. It really depends on how we are scoping the project. And we are a national funder. So we have partners across the nation, and they are schools as well as large national nonprofits and organizations and universities. And so we're really, again, looking to scope our funding in the way that is best suited to kind of supporting the innovation that we are naming. And I'll look forward to diving deeper in any of these topics with the team on this call and with the community that's gathered here. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Brooke. And next we will hear from Carolyn O'Brien with JP Morgan Private Foundation Services. Carolyn?
Thanks, Priya. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Really excited to be here. I'm Carolyn O'Brien, a program officer on the Private Foundation Services team at JP Morgan. And our team works with private foundations and charitable trusts to help execute on their grant making. Our team works with about 400 of these charitable entities, and makes about $230 million in grants each year. This is completely separate from the JP Morgan Chase Foundation. We are working with all private and family foundations. And we really work with clients in a couple of different ways. Our team was created because many foundations that were created decades ago named JP Morgan as their corporate trustee and have entrusted the firm with living on the philanthropic legacy, living on their philanthropic legacy in perpetuity. So oftentimes the donor may have passed away and JP Morgan is left as the sole trustee and decision maker to help both with investing the funds and then making sure that the grant making is effective. Sometimes we're working as a co-trustee, which could be with the donor, it could be with a family member, it could be with the family's friend or a trusted attorney, and the decision making is in partnership with that trustee. And then several years ago, we realized that this was a service that also clients of the JP Morgan Private Bank who had family foundations but did not yet have staff could benefit from to take on sort of the operational and administrative burden of running a foundation. So we work with those families to help them with their grant making and their giving and to make sure that they're executing properly. But JP Morgan does not have any decision-making authority in those cases. So what I always like to say is that if you know one foundation, you know one foundation, and that's probably becoming clear as each of us has gone around and sort of introduced what our foundations are focused on and how we interact with grantees and what the priorities are. And that's really true in my work because we see that we have some foundations that have very specific guidelines. They want to make sure that they're giving to blindness organizations in Louisville, Kentucky, and that's what our team needs to live on for them. We have other foundations that are much more open in nature. It could be any nonprofit with a budget over $1 million in New York City is eligible to apply. I work with a foundation that covers 13 states in the southeastern United States, thinking about technical assistance and capacity building. So kind of you name it, we cover it. We are generalists in the most traditional sense of the term, working across program areas and geographies and working with grantees in a number of different ways. So again, sometimes we are soliciting proposals, sometimes there's an open application process, and sometimes it's as simple as a client or a foundation just saying, we'd like to make a grant to this organization. Can you make sure it's a 501c3? So for the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to try to keep my work and my frame fairly broad to give sort of an idea of all of the different ways that grant makers work. And then, can focus in on some of our larger foundation partners and how their grant making, how they operate their grant making and sort of what the proposal process looks like and how we make sure that we're executing in both an efficient and effective manner. So I'm happy to sort of dig into all of it. And thanks again for having me.
Thanks, Carolyn. So now I'd like to invite all our panelists to unmute themselves and come back on with their videos so we can move into more of a conversation. Thank you all so much for the thought and care with which you shared what your work entails and what your organizations focus on. I've just been kind of taking a look at the introductions viewers have shared in the chat, and they are at least as diverse as we are in terms of their areas of study and the organizations they're with, and somewhat in where they're located. So I would love for us to kind of start out talking about some broad topics, and then we'll kind of narrow down into some more detailed things. I think each of you in various ways has touched on, the the fields in which you focus on to different degrees, obviously, because some of you have broader portfolios and some of us have more specific portfolios. But I wonder if maybe we could just take the next few minutes to share what you're observing in terms of talking about the funding landscape. And of course, I would imagine that would vary by field, but I think there might be some similarities too, just in terms of the kind of year people have come through in terms of the pandemic and what you're seeing, what you're seeing in terms of the fields that you are trying to have impact in, and maybe what you're seeing in terms of the what applicants are experiencing as you look at who you're trying to support. I might just briefly kick it off and then turn it over to anyone else who wants to go next. As sort of a representative of arts and culture here. I think Gisele, you used the word upended, and boy, has arts and culture been upended as a result of pandemic closures. First, it was a result of pandemic closures, and then of course, the re-examination that so many of us are going through with the intensification of last summer's the racial equity movement as we went into summer 2020, and that continues. So certainly, folks that we're serving in the sector that we're trying to support has experienced severe disruptions and closures, and we think of communities are losing artists because they can't afford to live there. So some of those kinds of things are part of the picture in terms of our funding landscape. Anyone else want to kind of share some of what you're seeing? Feel free to hop in.
I'm happy to hop in with, I think any educators or folks in the field of education or parents know that the field of education has been upended in many ways, and Gisele touched on that, with so many students in hybrid or remote learning environments, with the fact that many districts have not been able to locate, like we're missing thousands of students in terms of like, have they, like districts cannot find them. And so the system itself has been upended, and that connection of school for communities, for families, has been disrupted. And when we think about our work in whole child development, we recognize how critical it is to do a few things. One is focus on kind of that connection and well-being, and how can we support our educators, our communities, our families, to find ways to stay connected and recognize that kind of relationships and connection are the foundation of learning. But also, I touched on that false dichotomy, like the disruption in education right now in the funding landscape. It is encouraging this false dichotomy that you're either going to focus on academic recovery or you're going to focus on the whole child. And so we're seeing that in kind of the landscape, and are deeply committed to making sure that we recognize that it's not an either or.
So I'll tack on to Brooke's response, and as she shared, we do a lot of business together. What we heard in the earliest days of COVID was a request from folks up and down the ed ecosystem for tools, resources, and support, as opposed to white papers or guidance level mandates, right? And so we moved pretty quickly to partner with a diverse group of funders to get tools, resources out to not only states, but to districts, and then direct to educators. And so that wasn't our historic model of the work, but it was responsive to not only the acute demand, but the diversity of demand. And so, as Brooke named, part of the work is not only anchoring on what we've always known, because the science and deep practice has told us about the primacy of relationships, but also stepping back to ask more fundamental questions like, are the adults well? right? And what role do we need to play in supporting adults and the associations or convening platforms to get out resources and supports to educators? Because if we're honest, they have borne quite a bit of the burden of a quick pivot from in-person to remote while managing their own lives and all of what are the pressors, stressors, and health implications that we're all living in. And so we really have calibrated to provide lifelines to our historic grantees, as well as partner with some new folks to get tools, resources, but also guidance on implementation level guidance out to associations of adults and support districts to step back and see the needs in different ways of their multiple stakeholders, namely adults.
Thanks. Carolyn, I see.
Yeah,
The signal, you unmuted yourself.
Exactly. I'll take this question just from sort of a larger, broader view of what we were seeing, not specific to one program area, but sort of how we saw the foundations that we work with react to 2020. And there were a couple of different things. And I think for foundations that were sort of in an active cycle where we had received proposals before March and then had to decide what we were going to do, we saw a huge shift to general operating and unrestricted support, which I think was really important and reactive to make sure that you weren't putting your grantees in a position where you said, you submitted something in January and we're going to hold you to that, when that wasn't realistic for a lot of organizations. For some of the foundations that we work with that are more reactive in their grant making, what we saw really in sort of the March-April timeframe was a huge shift to basic needs. A lot of funding to food banks and making sure that students had access to technology and internet and those types of things. And then as we got farther into it, we sort of saw people shifting to exactly like Gisele said, the lifelines for their long-term grantees to make sure that they could bridge the gap. And at that time, we still had no idea how long this would last. And now that we're into 2021 and still living in this, I think it's now sort of trying to use the lessons learned from 2020 and really make capacity building investments in organizations to say, we don't know what normal looks like, but let's make sure that we're investing in the right things so that the organizations are sustainable in the long term. So I think it's been really interesting to see sort of how the focus has shifted as we've gone through this, but people continue to react to the environment that we're in.
Can I jump in, Priya? I kind of building on what Carolyn said, I think that there's this sort of, there are the two phases. We also kind of jumped in and tried to be very responsive in the early days of the crisis. We, because of the way the trust is structured, it's easy for us to pool money from other foundations. And so we were able to do put together a fund that ended up raising and distributing a little over $100 million in the first few months. And a lot of that was just straight up emergency relief. And then within my portfolio and my colleagues on the competitive grant side, I think the challenge now is thinking about balancing the need to be a source of stability and consistency with the need to make sure that your limited dollars are as responsive as they can be. And so I would say, like, for example, in one of my portfolios is arts education. And what that looks like there is that in the early days of the pandemic, I worked with the city, with the DOE, and a small cohort of linchpin arts groups to support the development of online learning curricula, arts education curricula that can be rolled out to classroom teachers across the city. So the goal there was just like ensuring that as many kids as possible still have access to arts ed. But now As some of you who are New Yorkers may know, our city's budget for partnerships with arts groups, which was one of the primary delivery mechanisms for arts ed in the city, has been virtually eliminated. So the focus now is on shoring up those groups to the limited extent that we can. Obviously, we can't duplicate government, but trying to kind of shore up the nonprofit arts education infrastructure and get teaching artists working directly with as many kids as possible.
Thanks. Yeah, as I think about coordinated funding efforts that I was part of or have been part of over the past year, there certainly was this early focus on relief, and then it kind of shifted to recovery, and like where we used to think and talk a lot about sustainability, long-term sustainability, which we still do. I feel like there was a shift in language to resilience, and it's kind of thinking about what components are necessary for resilience, and some of those might also be necessary for long-term sustainability, but they're maybe not exactly one and the same. And kind of thinking about, as you mentioned, Carolyn and Leigh, like the changing project dollars into general operating funding that can be more flexible, and kind of now I think that for us certainly, and I've kind of seen this for other funders as well, is just doing that initially has also kind of planted the seed that may not have been there before to think more about how the flexibility around general operating support can be really helpful for more than just COVID recovery, right? Like more just for making it through COVID. Actually, I'll share a question from one of the viewers, participants, relating to that. How are your respective organizations or clients thinking about general operating support versus for project funding in light of the trend toward equitable grant making and empowering organizations by easing funding restrictions? Does anyone, I don't know if anyone wants to kind of maybe take that one first, and others of us can join in if we wish.
I think it's so core to, and maybe it didn't pop in my initial introduction, but core to our strategy development at Raikes is really partnering with those that are most intimate and proximate. And so when I think about how we develop strategy, what we prioritize, and how we leverage not only our resources for catalytic investment, where there isn't yet significant demand or momentum in the field, but operators, leading researchers, community-based coalitions are saying there's something here. Here is a body of work that we'd like to prioritize. We lean into that and partner with them significantly, right? And so no, we don't defer strategy development to operators, but we partner in meaningful ways to co-construct. I often call it, conspire for the good of the country and in service of educational equity and justice. And so when I think about what trust-based philanthropy or power moves would call philanthropy to do in terms of authentically partner with those that are most impacted, really creating the context for them to not only influence, but to play across the entire spectrum, we didn't make a hard pivot from that. And so we in fact doubled down, but in the asking of what is most urgent, I think it's worth naming then that we are not a foundation that takes unsolicited requests. We do put out requests for applications, requests for proposals, but again, it's in response to demand that significant field actors are elevating as the most pressing or urgent need. And so I think it's an interesting space to be in, where we've always prioritized general operating, and leaned into the mechanics as well as the due north or values of trust-based philanthropy. And so I don't see that shifting, nor do I see us pulling away from real system level investments. So I don't see that the new program or the new idea is something that we would necessarily be funding versus picking up where there is community-based demand and elevating and leveraging what I think are our tools around convening and bridging and bringing diverse voices together in service of meeting this moment and advancing policy that can create the kind of system that we would all want.
Thanks, Gisele. Anyone else on this particular question?
I'll just say really briefly, I think, like Leigh said, when COVID hit, we focused a lot on general operating supports and offered our current grantees the option of moving project-based work over to general operating support. But it isn't just kind of, we are shifting a lot of our work over, or our funding over to general operating supports, recognizing where the expertise lies, right? And like the hoops that grantees have to like jump through to like scope a project. So it's really more about kind of, are we finding partners and organizations that share our North Star, that share the kind of near-term goals that we're focusing on, and trust them and decenter ourselves and invest in their expertise in the way that they're doing the work.
Thanks. And I might just add briefly, from our perspective, we we have been, and now this is kind of accelerated a bit due to the events of the past year, looking at doing more, more, flexible funding, more general operating grants, more multi-year grants, kind of taking a look at, Knight does we do a lot of project support, and that could be a year or that could be multi-year. And I think part of it is, especially in arts and culture, we do, one of our signature programs is called the Knight Arts Challenge, which is literally, arts projects, and that, kind of could take like a year to 2 years to come to fruition. And then we also do the sort of program support or infrastructure support, or general operating support. But I would say, I think, we have been trying to move in the direction of doing more flexible and longer term support when possible, while not getting rid of those project opportunities, because especially I think for artists, that is sometimes that makes sense, if you're an individual artist or collective and you've got something, specific you're wanting to get done, it's not necessarily tied to an organizational infrastructure. And that said, I think another thing that we've really been having a lot of conversations about is the way that, organizations that are either led by people of color and or serving communities of color or low-income communities tend to get shorter term grants and project-based grants versus general operating and flexible support, and what that means for their long-term sustainability. And when kind of we're re-examining, when we think about what indicates potential for sustainability to us, are we looking at the right things? Are the things we're looking at fair, to expect of organizations that have not had that access to capital traditionally, and also haven't had access to capital maybe from communities where they raise money, because those communities haven't had access to capital, and that's a cycle that of course perpetuates. So these are all things that we're examining internally, and also in conversation with colleagues in the field. Another kind of question that we have kind of talked about amongst this group, and that we're also hearing from viewers, is more information about kind of how you either seek out, potential investments or develop those relationships. I think Gisele and Brooke, especially, you've talked about really intentional partnership development that you do in your work. Carolyn, you referenced some of your clients are highly reactive, and then others have different approaches. So obviously there's a range, but I wonder if each of you, for the benefit of our viewers, might be able to just share a little bit of insight into either, different approaches that maybe your clients take or that you take with your funding mechanisms, and then in terms of really identifying those potential investments or partners or grantees. Anyone can go first. Go ahead, Leigh. Thanks.
So we have an open application process at the trust, and we have a rolling deadline. So that means that anyone can apply anytime, year round. But we do put out RFPs and LOIs around, targeted goals or issue areas. But then in addition to that, if there is a particular issue that I want to make some grants around, but that I don't think merits an RFP. So I only like to do an RFP if I have, it kind of depends, but at least $1 million to put out in grants. I just think if you do an RFP, you're encouraging folks to spend a lot of time on a proposal, and I don't think it's fair to do that if you can't make a fair number of grants. Our average grant size is about $75K to $100K. So for reference. So, but sometimes, like right now, I'm trying to do some more grant making around domestic violence and intimate partner violence. So that's when I would reach out to folks that I know or that my colleagues know, often at city agencies, sometimes academic researchers, but also just like folks from key agencies to try to figure out who's doing what and kind of what projects are happening, and how our dollars might be most effective. Occasionally I will convene like a focus group of prospective grantees to see what they're doing and if they're interested in a particular kind of grant making opportunity. But I will say that kind of outreach I try to be really careful about. So I think that grantees or nonprofit staff's time is really valuable, and I wouldn't just organize a focus group or do a call with someone just for my own, to go on a learning expedition. There has to be like a real feeling that money could be going out to the folks in the room. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thanks, Leigh. It does. Thanks. Go ahead, Carolyn.
We take a pretty similar approach, so I'll just sort of add on to that, it's sort of, from where we sit, it's nice because we have a good number of foundations that have an open application process. So we're seeing lots of different things come in across the country in different program areas. And then when our clients are asking about something specific, we often can use a different foundation's examples to say, oh, I just read a proposal about that came in over here, and now I can tell you about that group. And when there are things that we don't know about or maybe don't have the answer to, exactly like Leigh said, it's really using the network of other foundations, because we are such generalists. If clients are asking something very specific, the best way for us to get good grantees is to reach out to other foundations that are much more focused than we are. But like Leigh said, respecting the time of the grantees, so not using their time, but using our networks to make sure that we're being reactive and getting the right groups to the right foundations.
I'll just build quickly on that. We have, I couldn't agree more with Leigh, like to run an RFA or RFP, you want to make sure that you're making the right use of your partner's time. We've run those to kind of, but also to get out of our echo chamber of kind of those who have the social political capital to kind of directly contact us. So they're like, those are really important tools. And we work to make those applications as short and like manageable as possible. and run webinars and kind of like learning series before the application is due to make sure everyone has access to how we're thinking about it and like the questions that some again might have access to the foundation or the initiative. But we've also done a lot of work with connecting to funders collaboratives that we're part of. So we're not funding in like the career pathways space, but if we do have kind of that kind of outreach, we will kind of bring it to the funders collaborative space where there are subgroups focusing on that. And in addition to that, we also have used our convening structure to build out our network of partners. And so we recognize it as a space where we don't have a direct connection to large grant making. We make that perfectly clear, but we create, hopefully in person again in the coming years, but we have done a number of large convenings where we're asking folks to come together and kind of create some of those innovative partnerships I spoke to. And for those, we've offered what we call collaboration grants, which are very, very small, kind of $5,000 grants for those people to find their way back to each other, visit each other's school or organization, follow up. And we've seen those kind of create a pathway toward some of our other grant making opportunities. So we think of convening and building out this network as a tool for kind of some folks to enter conversations connected to more direct grant making.
So I think one of the most powerful levers that I as a philanthropoid have is holding myself accountable, but my team setting some pretty clear priorities around how we partner and with whom, always with an eye toward remaining as intimate and proximate with folks that are not only impacted, but are hyperlocal in their community. And so, as Brooke mentioned, through shared funding tables like Grant Makers for Thriving Youth Policy Working Group, we invest in 9 state coalitions, bringing together grass tops and grassroots. And those within that context, the grassroots and grass tops are finding each other, right? So we're not curating that experience. We're opening up the door to say, if you want to be in deeper partnership, we are happy to fund in service of transformation across larger regions or states. When I think of how the first Bell investment was curated, I was a grantee. In fact, Raikes was my 3rd largest funder during my time at Turnaround. And so Raikes pulled together a group of leading researchers, practitioners, and thought leaders on what it would take to transform at scale our education system. And so those were the folks that acted not only as a design hub, but a broad group of stakeholders engaged in review of the request for applications. So always calibrating how we decenter ourselves. And while I spent 20 years as an operator, leading organizations, designing programs, really pushing toward a just and equitable society, but really in service of Black and Brown youth, every day away from the direct work means that I am less proximate. And so bringing folks to the table that can guide our RFA process, our RFP process, and can help us stand further back to say, and how resonant is this with what you're seeing in the field, what we're seeing in the field as co-contributors to a process. So I think it's helpful to know that even when foundations are invite only, it's typically, in my case, it's typically within the context of a process. And then when we do issue catalytic grants, it's because we are identifying or responding to overwhelming demand in the market or the field, right? And so again, coming back to the earliest days of COVID, there was a resonant and drumbeat of demand for tools, resources, and getting what was known to shift experience of school and support educators to reliably produce equitable outcomes, recognizing how challenging that would be in a COVID remote stance, we move pretty quickly to do some catalytic investments. But again, it's always with an ear toward what's the field asking for and how can we support meeting that demand.
Thanks, Gisele. Yeah, as I think about our work at Knight, and especially within the arts and culture program, your point about proximity is so important. And, we're kind of a strange beast because, as I mentioned in my kind of opening comments, we're a national funder in that we fund in 26 communities, and 8 of those are sort of core cities for us where we have offices. And so we've got teams who live there, staff who live there. But, our arts program and our journalism program really are headquartered like in Miami, in the headquarters. And so we work really closely with our colleagues in our other program area who live in the other cities. And then we depend on visits to those cities, which of course have been difficult during the past year, impossible to do. And then we work closely with our reviewers. We pull together panels of like readers or reviewers for our open calls when we do those, and those change over, from one open call to the next to some degree, so that we kind of are always trying to make sure that we're hearing from new perspectives or different perspectives, and it's not always the same people that we're looking to for that on the ground perspective. And especially when we do open calls, but not just that. I mean, Knight does really, a lot of opportunities, investments that we do are once things that, come to us, people bring to us ideas that they're working on, or we do open calls. And with those, we really try to spend a lot of time, in those communities. So we do multiple trips where we're doing sort of information sessions in different neighborhoods, and trying to get to different parts of the city and make sure we're making ourselves available. And we do coffee chats, we call them. It's kind of like meeting a different sort of coffee shop or something in different neighborhoods around the city to have one-on-one time with folks where they can kind of just either pitch the idea, but it's not really like a pitch. It's more like, let's find out more about each other. And then we try to help them strengthen their proposals. Sometimes we'll even read their draft and we'll like give them feedback on how to strengthen their proposal. And it's a lot of sort of on the phone hand holding. We'll promote things in multiple languages. In terms of getting the word out in different languages. And we also accept proposals in multiple languages. Most proposals we get do come in English, but we do occasionally get, a proposal in Spanish or maybe Haitian Creole, depending on the city and the neighborhood, and then we will translate it. So just kind of always trying to think about ways that we can be more accessible, and that we can also get to know more folks and more of what's happening in the communities that we support. One thing that it's not directly a question that we had kind of talked about before, but I'm sort of hearing threads of this in your comments for the panel. I wonder if you might, and not everyone needs to, speak to this necessarily, but I'm curious to hear how you think about community, or how you think about your constituencies that you serve. I think that's something. I think that's always important and helpful, I hope, for the folks who are tuning in to hear about how funders think about this, because I think it hopefully helps, to find opportunities for synergy, and how to kind of build relationships with funders. But I wonder if you might just share a bit about either how you think of that, or maybe how you observe that your clients and partners think of that.
So historically, in the K-12 portfolio of giving, we think of our direct community as divorced from our partners' community as intermediaries that are likely to be called by schools and districts that have solutions or are known resources to them. Researchers that are engaged in community-based action research, right? Co-funders that are in service of a just and equitable society. And so if those are my nearest community, I hold and create convening platforms for them to be in community with schools, with districts, and with each other, so that they can share across 3 different lenses. And I think this is germane to how we fund. What they know and are so convicted by that they want to bake into the grammar of schooling going forward, where there is emergent knowledge, but they haven't yet gotten to proof of concept. And so they are sharing with other intermediaries, they're sharing with schools and districts to say, we believe this is promising, we can't bank on it, but how do we find each other to test, grow, and advance the field's knowledge, but also expand upon the goals of the system. And then to be in closer proximity to each other, but also schools and district partners, right? To really disentangle where there's been blood, sweat, equity, and they still haven't gotten to solutions, right? And so that's who I think of as my community, who we prioritize, and what we ensure in our grant making is that our partners are never coming to the table with us or with each other without their core partners. So we will layer into grants or requirements, even in an open RFA or P, that intermediaries or researchers bring, not as informants, but as co-designers and core members of the team, focal schools. When I think of our investment in National Equity Project to launch 2 different networks of school districts, those teams include superintendents, members of the leadership team, 4 or more focal schools that have a full cadre of leadership to educator, to families, to students, right? And always having students and end users at the table. And so it's how we remain incredibly intimate and proximate, but it's almost always through an arm's length extension. So it's a little bit of a both and.
Thanks, Gisele. Anyone else?
I'll just build on that briefly. I mean, I think that I'll give a concrete example. We believe strongly that our work has to be community proximate, but we're a national foundation. We have a community team at the initiative that focuses on the Bay Area, and we have those connections there. But to Gisele's last point, sometimes as much as we want to be very, very close to the work, we have to decenter ourselves and find the right partners who have that deep community proximity. So for example, when we funded and supported some of the implementation guidance that Gisele was talking about in terms of how COVID was hitting school districts and how to prioritize well-being and connection. But we also recognized when funding the actual implementation, mental health and well-being cannot be done in a way that is not locally and culturally relevant. And so we built a portfolio that actually invested in community foundations and community organizations who know their communities well to actually provide the funding to implement well-being supports in communities. And we're staying close to those partners, but just recognizing there's a structure that needs to be put in place in service of the work that often decenters ourselves.
Thanks, Brooke. I'm going to start weaving in some more of the questions from audience members that relate to what we're talking about. So one is, what should new grantees focus on when it comes to establishing a potential ongoing funding relationship? Should it be a specific program, school, district, researchers? And I might just broaden that question as well, since we have multiple fields represented. How might some of you advise folks who are new grantees and wanting to develop maybe a longer term relationship?
Do you mean like prospective applicants or folks who already have a grant and want to sort of turn that into a longstanding?
The question that was submitted says new grantee, but I think it would be valuable to hear about both. If you want to kind of share a little bit about maybe a prospective applicant who's trying. We have also gotten that question about the challenge of applying to a foundation when they maybe not have a personal connection yet. So maybe a prospective applicant, what advice would you give them? And then maybe someone who's getting a grant for the first time and looking for a longer term funding relationship or partnership.
So I could speak to that. I mean, I am guessing it's sort of different for each of us, but at the trust, I don't do meetings with folks unless I have a proposal in hand and know there's some chance of funding it. And that's just because we do have an open application process, and frankly, the volume is huge. And I am always worried, if I do a meeting with this person, but not that person. So unless there's something specific that I'm reaching out and inviting a proposal, but I do, if I decline a proposal, I'm happy to talk to anybody about why that is. What I would say that's useful if you're applying to a project funder like the trust is to really make sure that it's a project. I know that sounds obvious, but I sometimes worry that we're not clear enough in communicating that. So to be really specific, in our case, it's best if it's, you're starting something or strengthening something or expanding something, or you're advocating for a particular policy, but to really not be afraid to drill down into what it is that you really want to do and how you're going to do that. It's this policy and we're going to have meetings with these people and we're going to organize 7 events and, whatever it is, so that I have something to respond to, and also so that I can see that you have clarity about how things might look and what activities you want to undertake. Understanding that the context could change, you may end up doing something different. But I think that's the best way to get your foot into the door, because even if I can't fund that project, I have a really clear idea about what you do and how you go about doing it. And then with existing grantees, I don't know if there's a magic way to do it. I just try to be really open, and I would say, let your funder know what's happening with the grant. If you're having trouble, reach out and say, don't just wait until when you submit the final report. If you have questions, if you need things, I think that if you already have a grant, I would encourage folks, at least at the trust, to take advantage of that and try to get any questions that you might have answered throughout the process.
Thanks, Leigh. Carolyn, go ahead.
Yeah, we will take phone calls with organizations if we don't have a proposal in hand. But I think the key for us is that, you have to have sort of done a little bit of homework before you do that outreach to make sure that you understand the types of organizations that we do fund. In my case, that you are asking about a specific foundation, that you're not just reaching out and saying, do you have any foundations that would be interested in funding us? Like I said, we work with 400, so can't answer that question that easily. But, I have a foundation that's New York City based capacity building funder. If you have a very specific capacity building project that you'd like to run by me, I'm open to that conversation. If you just write me an email that says, do you think the foundation is interested in our organization? I'm more unlikely to take that call. So I think just, taking 15 minutes, reading the website, looking at grants that have been made historically, and then doing the outreach is the best way to start that relationship. And then I think for first-time grantees, to maintain the relationship, it's thinking about those sort of key moments throughout the year, throughout the grant cycle, where you can send something that's a little bit more specific to the foundation that you're working with versus just the email blasts that go out, because I think we all get so many of them. So just to say, hey, Carolyn, I thought this would be particularly interesting to you is a really good way to stay in touch. So it doesn't just feel like the only way we're getting anything is if it's going to all of your funders, but just to say, I'd love to share this with you, or have a quick call to explain this to you. I think that's a really nice way to build the relationship over time.
That's great advice. Go ahead, Brooke.
We also do take meetings with folks who don't have an active proposal to learn more about their work. And I think just very briefly, I would say, like, I encourage, and I think Leigh touched on this, just authenticity, like being true to who you are, what your organization does, and not trying to adopt language or fit into like a current proposal, because building a relationship and understanding the work of an individual or their organization and truly what they do is the better like approach for longer term potential. So I would just reinforce that authenticity.
I agree, Brooke. You know, something that I find that I encounter, and I won't speak for anyone else, but certainly for Knight Foundation, I think it's certainly helpful to, you know, so yes, we accept LOIs. We also, for the arts program, we kind of prefer not LOIs, but kind of just emails and reach out, and then to have a conversational approach of like getting to know each other and seeing if there's a mission fit there and a synergy. But I think that folks often, I don't blame them, you know, assume that this is the specific project for which like we might be interested, but we'd actually like to get a bigger picture view of who you are and what you're working on. And because there might be something else, you know, that you know, some other potential area of synergy with Knight Foundation that, you know, the person we're speaking with or the organization we're speaking with just may have no idea unless you get into that conversation. So we like to try to have a kind of a broader, more open conversation to then find those potential areas where we could work together. Another question, we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but to get a little more specific is, what are the main characteristics of a successful proposal? And I might ask if you could, you know, talk about the proposal, or even just what you're looking for in maybe the organization or a team, you know, as you look at a potential investment.
I think the most successful proposals strike the balance and are unapologetically so clear about how they are leading for transformation at the intersection of the science of learning and development in service of equity, and are centering and rooted in community leadership. And so those are non-negotiables for us in our K-12, but across our entire portfolio of giving at the foundation. And so the ways in which we ask probing questions, but folks are elevating what's the demand in community that brought them into existence versus what was their agenda and what community did they go out to find to partner with, right? And so being clear about how they are in service of what authentically was a need, a demand, and then how we can be in closer partnership. Because for us, the financial resource is significant, but it is not the sum total of what we do. I do think of each of our partners, including folks that I don't ultimately fund, I think of them as co-conspirators in the work. And so how can I elevate their work, their platform, engage in bridging and make connections for them? And so it, again, to the extent that people can be transparent about what they're in service of and how they are getting to impact in the lives of young people and upending what has been an incredibly corruptive system for many of the young people that have been least well served. That's what we're looking for.
Thanks, Gisele. Anyone else? I might just also share some like a quick sort of tip that we often give folks who are, especially when they're working on their the application for the open call, which is you know, the ones that are project based. But I think this can be apply to other situations as well. You know, we say, you know, please tell us like, what is it? What's the thing you're working on that you're seeking funding for? Why this? Why you? Why are you the right team to be doing this thing? And why now? I think if we're looking at what we're, you know, like you said, Carolyn and others, and, you know, like limited dollars, but looking at, you know, this convergence of the idea and the team that's working on it, and you know, the timeliness or the urgency, whatever that might be, whether it's need or opportunity. Knight really thinks of it as opportunity versus need. If you can sort of encapsulate those things and help get that across to us, it is so helpful to considering the investment. So we're close to being done with time, out of time, and we have so many questions, and I think we'll do a closing question before Elisa comes back on, and might ask Elisa to help us figure out how we might be able to get other questions answered some other way. But wanted to just kind of pose a closing question to each of you, and it could just be round robin style. You know, as you think about your work and looking ahead to the rest of this year, maybe, and beyond, what are you hopeful for or optimistic about? And which brave soul would like to go first?
I'll go first. I think that I am hopeful that we can use 2020 as a learning experience and find good ways to make sure that we're sort of thinking about investing in the future and using it as, you know, a very traumatic year, but something that we can all think about and learn from and make really good, impactful investments and move forward in partnership, and really just learn.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Yeah, I am hopeful that what we have gone through in the last year, but also like centuries of our historical experience as a country, that last year is a point for transformation. That we can kind of recognize where there are some like incredible tailwinds for transformation. I'm thinking of parents and caregivers who are naming that they don't want everything to go back to the way it was. Like, how do we actually invest in their voice and their demand? And I'm also very hopeful that racial equity will not become, you know, go back to like a side portfolio or something that we do like other than our work, and that it's deeply embedded in everything that we're doing.
It's not surprising that Brooke and I are in service of the same thing. I am most hopeful that all of the compounded crises and the multidimensional nature of all of those crises of 2020 that have followed us into this year create a space where there is demand, appreciation, and respect for where power lives currently, but where it should live, which is with young people, with community, with those that are most intimate and have been least well served by our systems, to set a vision for redesign, and that our policy drivers, our education influencers can create the space to center those folks, not just their voice, but in the co-design, in the co-leadership, in the implementation, and the accountability systems.
Thanks, Gisele. Thanks, Brooke. Thanks, everyone on the panel for your insights, and thank you, viewers, for joining and for sharing your questions with us as well. Hi, Elisa. Back to you.
Hi. Just first off, I want to just do a quick, a round of applause for all of our incredible panelists and Priya for moderating today. From everyone within the TC community, just thank you so much for taking the time to speak to all of us about your foundations, helping us navigate the grant making process, and providing more insights in the world of philanthropy. And to the audience members, I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions. It was just incredible, all the questions that you had, and I wish we could get to all of them, but thank you so much for, staying tuned for, an hour and a half with our event today. And I would like to also mention, please everyone stay tuned to our emails and our social media for details on future events, including the power in words, the importance of language and honoring individuals and communities with TC alumna Fan Chen Cox and Yolanda C. Ruiz on February 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We hope to see you all at future TC alumni events. Until then, thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks, everyone.